He came to the mountains to outrun memories, but memory had longer legs than any man. John had bought the land sight unseen, a forgotten parcel in a valley that maps seemed to have misplaced. The agent had called it secluded. John called it defensible. He came here seeking the kind of quiet that was so deep it had a sound of its own, a low hum that might finally drown out the ringing in his ears, the echo of an order given and a silence that followed. His dog, Shepherd, had been the first to understand. The old German shepherd, his muzzle a distinguished gray, had stepped from the truck, not with the frantic energy of a pet, but with the slow, deliberate assessment of a professional clearing a room. He had tasted the air, his gaze sweeping the ridgeline, and then he had looked at John as if to say, "This will do." As John began his work, he found his old rhythms returning. The precise, economical movements of a life spent in disciplined service. His olive field jacket, worn to the soft texture of a second skin, became his uniform once more. His military-issue watch, its face scratched from places he no longer named, measured a time that now belonged only to him and the sun's slow arc across the valley. He moved with a quiet economy that the forest seemed to respect, his worn leather boots making little sound on the damp earth. The mountains held their breath around him, their silence a heavy blanket. But it was a silence with teeth. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, know that some valleys are not for hiding, but for healing. God sometimes leads us to quiet places not to forget, but to finally listen. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. Like and subscribe to this channel and let this story unfold. John had chosen this place for its emptiness, but Shepherd found it full of ghosts. The dog was a veteran, same as him. He'd worked lines in lands of dust and rock, his nose deciphering stories of fear and desperation left in the soil. Here, in the green quiet of the Appalachian foothills, he was supposed to be retired. But the old dog was never entirely off duty. He patrolled the perimeter of their small, dilapidated cabin with a gravity that felt almost judgmental, as if critiquing John's choice of a defensive position. John would watch him from the porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, and feel a flicker of dry amusement. The dog carried himself with the air of a senior non-commissioned officer who had seen too many lieutenants come and go. Their bond was forged in a language that had no words. It was in the tilt of the dog's head, the subtle shift of his weight, the way his breathing would change from a soft pant to a measured, silent intake of air. John could read him better than any map. Shepherd was his compass, his early warning system, his conscience. John had come here to be alone, but he was never truly alone. He had Shepherd, and in the profound, watchful silence of the dog, John found a strange sort of anchor. He was a man adrift, and the dog was the one solid thing in a world that had turned to water. On the third day, it happened. They were walking the property line, a meandering path marked by ancient, moss-covered stones that served as a fence. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. John was lost in the rhythm of the walk, his thoughts a low, familiar hum of regret. Then, Shepherd stopped. It wasn't a gradual halt. He froze mid-stride, one paw lifted, his body as rigid as iron. His head was cocked, ears flattened slightly, his entire being focused on a point just beyond their property, deep within a thicket of rhododendron that was nearly impenetrable. A low rumble started in his chest, so deep John felt it more than heard it. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of profound unease. Something was wrong. John stopped, his hand instinctively going to the folding knife clipped to his pocket. He scanned the woods, his eyes trained to see the unnatural line, the flicker of movement. Found nothing. The forest was still. The birds were silent. Even the wind seemed to have died. He trusted the dog. He had trusted him in places where a mistake was the last thing you ever made. He put a hand on Shepard's neck, the muscle beneath the thick fur bunched and hard. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. The dog didn't relax. He just stood there, a living statue, pointing the way to a secret the valley had kept for a very long time. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. The next morning, the feeling of wrongness lingered in the air like the mist clinging to the valley floor. John had slept poorly, the dog's unease seeping into his own subconscious. He woke to find Shepard sitting by the door. Not whining, not scratching, but simply waiting. His gaze fixed on the door with an unnerving patience. John pulled on his boots, the leather cool against his skin. He skipped coffee. This was not a morning for quiet contemplation. This was a morning for answers. He opened the door and Shepard moved without command, a gray and black shadow flowing across the damp ground. He didn't trot towards the woods. He moved with the focused, ground-eating gait of a dog with a mission. John followed, his Eberle-stock half-track pack settled comfortably on his shoulders, its weight a familiar reassurance. Shepard ignored John's quiet commands to heel, his focus absolute. He led him back to the old stone fence, to the exact spot where he had frozen the day before. He pushed his way through a gap in the stones, into the dense, dark green of the rhododendron thicket. The dog didn't just point. He acted. He began to dig, not with frantic energy, but with a methodical purpose, his powerful front paws scattering dirt and moss. He whined softly, a sound of intense concentration. John knelt beside him, pushing aside the thick, leathery leaves. "Easy, boy. Let me see." Shepard backed off but remained close, his breathing a series of sharp, focused pants. John's fingers, calloused and sure, brushed away the loose soil. He wasn't touching dirt. He was touching stone. Not the rough field stone of the fence, but something cut, squared, dressed stone. He used the tip of his knife to scrape away the grime and clinging roots. It was the corner of a foundation. He looked up, his gaze following the line of it into the suffocating green. This wasn't just a wall. It was a building. A surge of adrenaline, cold and familiar, washed through him. He stood up, his training taking over. Observe, orient, decide, act. He began to follow the line of the foundation, his body pushing through the tangled branches that clawed at his jacket. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, as if he were entering a cave. After 20 yards of struggle, the thicket opened up into a small, unnaturally clear space. And there it was, reclaimed by the forest, but undeniably present. The walls were stone, gray and streaked with green, rising perhaps 15 feet before crumbling into ruin. The roof was gone, surrendered to decades of snow and rain, its massive timbers now a chaotic lattice on the floor, covered in a thick blanket of moss. A nave, he realized. He was standing at the entrance to a church. A small, simple stone church, swallowed whole by the wilderness. A strange reverence settled over him. This was a place of intention, a place of peace that had been violated by time, but not erased. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on fallen slate. A bell, green with patina, lay on its side near the entrance, miraculously uncracked. Rows of simple wooden pews were overturned, scattered like bones. But they weren't rotted through. The dry air under the thick canopy had preserved them. It was a place of sudden, violent stillness, as if its congregation had simply vanished in the middle of a hymn. Shepard, who had followed him in, didn't explore. He walked directly to the far end of the structure, to the raised area where an altar must have once stood. Most of it was buried under a massive pile of collapsed roof beams and debris. The dog stopped at the edge of the pile, pawed once at the stone floor, and looked back at John. His message was clear. The secret wasn't the church itself. It was in it. Or, more accurately, under it. John spent the next hour working with a grim, focused energy. He used a fallen timber as a lever, his muscles straining as he moved the heavy beams one by one. Sweat slicked his hair and ran down his temples, but he barely noticed the exertion. He was a machine, clearing the objective. As he worked, he uncovered the altar stone, a single massive slab of granite broken in two. But Shepard wasn't interested in the altar. He was focused on the flagstones in front of it. John knelt down, running his hand over the stones. Most were rough, uneven. But one section, a neat square of 3 stones by 3, was different. The mortar lines were thinner, cleaner. The stones themselves were smoother, as if they were meant to be moved. He took a small pry bar from his backpack. He wedged the tip into a hairline crack and put his weight on it. The stone didn't budge. He repositioned, found a better purchase, and leaned again. This time there was a scraping sound, a protest of stone on stone. The flagstone tilted, then lifted. Beneath it was not dirt. It was a dark, hollow space. The air that rose from it was cold and smelled of dust and sealed away time. John shone his flashlight into the opening. It was a small, stone-lined crypt, no bigger than a coffin. And inside, sitting in the center of the dusty floor, was a single object. A dark green, metal footlocker, the kind he had seen 1,000 times in his former life. It was military spec, old but still solid. It was closed with 2 heavy latches, each secured with a rusty, formidable-looking padlock. Shepard whined softly, a note of completion. He had done his job. Now it was John's turn. The locks were old, but they were built to last. John studied them in the gloom of the ruined church, the beam of his flashlight tracing the rust-pitted steel. He could break them, of course. The pry bar and a heavy rock would make short work of the shackles. But that felt wrong. It felt like a violation. Whatever was in this box had been hidden with care, with purpose. Smashing his way in felt like kicking down a door when the key was waiting to be found. But the key was long gone, as lost as the congregation of this forgotten chapel. He needed information. He needed context. The box, the church, the strange emptiness of the surrounding land, they were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve from inside the valley. He needed to go to town. The thought was unappealing. Town meant people, noise, questions. It meant leaving the defensible quiet he had paid for. He looked at Shepard, who sat patiently, his gaze steady. The dog understood. This wasn't a retreat, it was reconnaissance. He carefully replaced the flagstone, marking its location with a small scratch on the wall that only he would recognize. He covered the area with a few smaller timbers, enough to obscure it from a casual glance. He wasn't sure who he was hiding it from, but the instinct for concealment was deeply ingrained. You never left an objective unsecured. The drive to the town of Harmony Creek was a journey back in time. His old truck rattled down the gravel track from his property onto a paved road that was cracked and patched, the yellow lines faded to ghosts. The town itself was nestled in a fold of the hills, a collection of brick storefronts and clapboard houses that looked tired but dignified. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and a stranger was an event. Shepard sat in the passenger seat, his head held high, looking out the window with the stoic disinterest of a visiting dignitary. John's first stop was the county clerk's office, a stately brick building with tall, wavy glass windows. The air inside was warm and smelled of old paper and floor wax. Behind a long wooden counter stood a woman who seemed as much a fixture as the building itself. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with intelligent, sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and a nameplate on the counter read, Martha Riley, County Clerk. She watched him approach, her expression neutral but appraising. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, no nonsense. "I'm looking for some old land deeds," John said, his voice quiet in the high-ceilinged room. "Plat maps, maybe, from the late 50s. Property address? Owner's name?" "It was called the Hollis parcel. I'm the current owner. It's up in the North Valley." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. "The Hollis place? Hasn't been anyone up there in 30 years. What are you looking for?" "I found a structure on the land, an old ruin. I'm trying to figure out what it was." He chose his words carefully. He didn't mention the church specifically, or the box, just a ruin. Her initial caution seemed to soften, replaced by a flicker of professional curiosity. "A ruin? Most everything up that way was cleared out for the reservoir." She turned and disappeared into a back room filled with towering shelves of massive leather-bound books. He could hear the faint sound of rollers as she pulled out a heavy drawer. She returned a few minutes later, unrolling a huge, brittle-looking map across the counter. "Here we are. North Valley Survey, 1955. Her long, bony finger traced the faded lines. "Here's the reservoir floodplain, and here," she tapped a spot, "is the Hollis parcel. Sits right on the edge of the state forest land." Her finger then moved to a spot just adjacent to his property. It was a small, oddly shaped blank space on the map, a sliver of white surrounded by the green of the state forest and the blue of the proposed reservoir. In the center of the blank space was a tiny, hand-drawn cross and a label written in faint, elegant script. "St. Jude's Chapel," she read aloud, her voice holding a note of surprise. "Deconsecrated 1958. She looked at John. "That must be your ruin. Funny. According to this, it's not on your land. It's not on anyone's land. It's a cartographical void. A forgotten piece." The pieces began to click into place. A deconsecrated church. A community that vanished. "What happened in 1958? John asked. Martha leaned back, folding her arms. The clerk was gone, replaced by the local historian she clearly was at heart. "The dam. The utility company, Appalachian Power and Light, built the Harmony Creek Dam, created the reservoir. They bought out the whole town of Havenwood. It sat right where the deep part of the lake is now. Farms, houses, stores, everything. Most folks moved on. A few stayed, moved to higher ground. But the town itself was drowned." "And the church?" "It was on high ground. Supposed to be spared," she said, frowning at the map. "I always heard they dismantled it, moved it. But if you found ruins..." Her voice trailed off. She looked from the map to John's face, her sharp eyes reassessing him. He wasn't just a curious landowner. There was a weight to his questions, a purpose. "You should talk to Alistair Finch," she said finally. "He's a retired history professor from the State University. Lives just outside of town. If anyone knows the truth about Havenwood, it's him." She wrote down a name and an address on a slip of paper. "Tell him Martha sent you. And," she added, her gaze direct, "if you find something important up there, you let me know. This office keeps the records. All of them." Dr. Alistair Finch lived in a small house overflowing with books. They were stacked on shelves, piled on tables, and perched on every available surface. He was a man in his 70s, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that lit up with an infectious passion when he spoke about the past. He greeted John at the door, ushered him into his cluttered study, and listened intently as John, guided by Martha's advice, explained his discovery.
"St. Jude's!" Finch exclaimed, his face breaking into a smile. "Of course!
The Lost Chapel of Havenwood. Oh, this is marvelous. He began pulling books from shelves, his movements spry and energetic. The official story, the one Appalachian Power put out, was that the church was carefully dismantled and its historical artifacts preserved. A lie, apparently. A beautiful, brazen lie. He spread an old photograph on his desk. It showed a small, proud stone church standing on a grassy knoll, a group of people in their Sunday best posing in front. It was the same church, whole and alive. This was the heart of the community, Finch said softly. When the dam was announced, it was devastating, but the company promised the church would be safe. It was above the flood line. He then found what he was looking for, a thin, bound volume of local newspaper clippings. He flipped through the yellowed pages until he found an article from 1958. Havenwood prepares for new future, the headline read. The article described the orderly relocation of the town's residents, praising the utility company for its generosity. But then Finch pointed to a small paragraph near the end. "Listen to this," he said, his voice dropping. "For safekeeping during the transition, the official town records, including deeds, ledgers, and the minutes of the town council, have been consolidated and secured in the crypt of St. Jude's Chapel, under the care of Reverend Michael Abernathy. They will be transferred to the county seat once the project is complete." Finch looked up at John, his eyes gleaming. They were never transferred, were they? Because the church wasn't relocated. It was abandoned, and the records were abandoned with it. The footlocker. The town's entire history sealed in a metal box and buried. "Why would they lie?" John asked. "That, my friend, is the question," Finch said. Havenwood was poor, but the land was theirs. They were farmers, loggers. They had roots. People don't just walk away from their homes for a pocketful of cash, no matter what the papers say. Unless they had no choice. The final piece fell into place with a sickening thud. John felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew what was in that box. It wasn't just history. It was evidence. He thanked the professor, his mind already back in the ruined church. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. "The company, Appalachian Power and Light. What's its parent company now?" Finch thought for a moment. "They've been bought and sold a few times. I believe the current conglomerate is called OmniGen Industries, a massive global corporation." OmniGen. The name hit John like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered the name from a classified file, from a pre-mission briefing in a dusty, air-conditioned tent thousands of miles away. A subsidiary of OmniGen had been involved in an illegal mining operation. The operation his team was sent to shut down. The operation where he had made a choice. The mission that had broken him. The past wasn't just haunting him. It had been waiting for him here, in this quiet, forgotten valley. If this chapter of John's journey stirred something in you, take a moment to reflect on the hidden histories in our own lives and communities. Sometimes the Lord asks us to be the ones to uncover what has been buried, to give voice to the voiceless. The work is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile. If you believe in the power of truth, please like, share, and leave a comment below. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue to bring you stories of faith, courage, and the quiet miracles that unfold when we choose to listen. The drive back to his land was a blur. The trees, the road, the sky, it all receded into a gray haze as the memory played out in his mind, sharp and brutal as broken glass. The heat, the smell of diesel and sand, the crackle of the radio, the voice of his teammate, Corporal Evans, young and steady, reporting contact, and his own voice, cold and detached, giving the order. "Hold position. Secure the objective first." The objective was a laptop, evidence of OmniGen's corporate crimes. They got the laptop. They lost Evans. The official report cited a tactical error, but John knew the truth. He had traded a man's life for a piece of hardware. He had followed the protocol. He had failed the man. He parked the truck and sat for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. Shepard watched him, his head resting on the center console, his brown eyes full of a wisdom that felt ancient and absolute. The dog didn't nudge him or whine. He simply bore witness. John got out of the truck, the cold mountain air a shock to his system. He had work to do. Back at the church, he worked with a feverish intensity. He pried open the heavy latches of the footlocker. The metal groaned in protest, then gave way. He lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and celluloid filled the air. It was packed tight. There were leather-bound ledgers, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon, and at the very bottom, a dozen reel-to-reel audio tapes, each carefully labeled in a precise clerical hand. Tucked beside them was a small, battery-powered tape player, the kind a journalist might have used in the 50s. There were even 2 spare batteries, still in their original cardboard packaging. Reverend Abernathy had been thorough. He had planned for this. John took the box back to his cabin. As dusk settled over the valley, he sat at his small wooden table, the contents of the footlocker spread out before him. He picked up a tape labeled Testimony of Elias Vance. He threaded it into the machine, the unfamiliar mechanism clumsy under his fingers. He put on the old oversized headphones, the cracked leather cool against his ears. He pressed play. There was a hiss, a crackle, and then a voice, clear and resonant, filled his head. Reverend Michael Abernathy, recording on October 12, 1958. I am here with Mr. Elias Vance. Another voice, older, rougher, filled with a weary anger. They called it an engineering report. Said the whole valley floor was shale, unstable. Said our homes would slide into the river inside of 5 years. Condemned. They condemned my farm. My grandfather built that house. And the offer they made, Mr. Vance? The Reverend prompted gently. Offer? It was an insult. 1/10 of what it was worth. But we had no choice. They had the paper from the state, said it was for the public good. Public good. The old man spat the words like poison. My family's been on that land for 100 years. What about their good? John listened for hours, his heart growing heavier with each tape. One by one, the ghosts of Havenwood spoke to him from the past. A woman weeping as she described being forced from her home. A store owner describing how the company's agents intimidated him into selling. It was a meticulous record of a crime, a slow, systematic theft of a community's soul, laundered through bureaucracy and lies. He saved the last tape for the end. It was labeled simply, My Final Entry. He pressed play. It was Reverend Abernathy's voice again, but different now. Strained, hurried. The sound of rain hammered against a roof in the background. They're here, the Reverend said, his voice a near whisper. The company men. They said they were here to dismantle the church, as promised. But they brought crowbars, not tools for preservation. They are not here to move it. They are here to break it. I have hidden the records. I have hidden this testimony. The truth of what was done to this valley is in this crypt. They lied about the land. They lied about the church. I do not know if anyone will ever find this. But God sees. God knows. I pray that one day a righteous man will come to this place and unearth what they have tried to bury. May God have mercy on their souls, and may He forgive me for my own powerlessness. The tape ended with a sudden clatter, then silence. John sat in the dark cabin, the only light from the moon slanting through the window. The silence in the headphones was deeper, more profound than the quiet of the valley. It was the silence of a truth that had been buried for over 60 years. And in that silence, he heard the echo of his own past. The same pattern of corporate greed, the same ruthless calculus that valued profit over people. He hadn't just stumbled upon a local injustice, he had stumbled back into his own war. And this time, he wasn't sure what the objective was, or what it would cost to secure it. The next morning brought a new kind of quiet. The air was heavy, charged, the sky a flat metallic gray. John stood on his porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching the tree line. He felt exposed, his small cabin a lonely outpost on a new front line. He had spent the night securing the evidence, carefully packing the ledgers and tapes back into the footlocker and hiding it in a hollow log deep in the woods behind his cabin. It was a temporary measure. He needed a better plan. He didn't have to wait long. Just after 9, he heard it, the crunch of tires on the gravel track that led to his property. It wasn't the sound of his own truck. This was a heavier vehicle, its engine a low, confident purr. Shepard, lying at his feet, lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest before the vehicle was even in sight. A pristine black SUV, the kind that belonged in a city garage, not a mountain valley, rolled to a stop 50 yards from the cabin. It was so clean it seemed to absorb the light. The driver's door opened and a man got out. He was in his late 40s, fit, with a handsome, unlined face. He was wearing expensive outdoor clothing, a sleek graphite gray jacket, tailored cargo pants, and boots that looked like they had been purchased an hour ago. He moved with an easy, confident stride, his smile pleasant and utterly devoid of warmth. "Mr. John Carrick?" the man called out, his voice smooth and modulated. He stopped at a respectful distance, hands held open in a non-threatening gesture. "My name is Davies. I represent the Havenwood Legacy Foundation." John didn't answer. He remained on the porch, his hand resting on Shepard's head, feeling the tension in the dog's powerful neck. The foundation was a subsidiary of Omnigen, he was sure of it. The lie had evolved, put on a suit, and learned to smile. "We're conducting a historical survey of the area," Davies continued, his smile unwavering. "Part of a land reclamation project approved by the state. We were surprised to find this cabin here. Our records showed this parcel as unoccupied." "The records were wrong," John said, his voice flat. Davies chuckled, a dry, practiced sound. "It seems so. No matter. We've also discovered the ruins of an old chapel nearby, St. Jude's, a fascinating piece of local history. Our foundation will be taking possession of the site to properly preserve the narrative and contextualize the historical assets." The language was a smokescreen, a cloud of corporate jargon designed to obscure and control. Preserve the narrative meant bury the truth. John felt a cold anger solidify in his gut. He thought of the voices on the tapes, of Reverend Abernathy's desperate prayer. He stepped off the porch, Shepard moving with him, a silent gray shadow at his side. He stopped a few feet from Davies. The man's cologne was a jarring, synthetic intrusion in the clean mountain air. "What about the people of Havenwood?" John asked, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. Davies' smile thinned almost imperceptibly. "They were compensated fairly, Mr. Carrick, according to the records. This is all just a procedural cleanup, a final chapter in a story that ended a long time ago." "I have a different set of records," John said. He reached into the pocket of his field jacket and pulled out one of the reel-to-reel tapes. He held it up, the brown ribbon stark against his calloused palm. "These records tell a different story." The mask of civility slipped from Davies' face for a fraction of a second. A flicker of cold, hard calculation showed in his eyes. He had not expected this. He had expected an ignorant squatter he could easily intimidate or buy off. He had not expected a man who had already done his homework. And then Shepard acted. The dog had been sitting calmly at John's side, a picture of disciplined restraint. Now he rose to his feet. He didn't move forward. He didn't bark. His body went rigid, every muscle tensed.
He lowered his head slightly, and the fur on his neck bristled. A low, menacing growl vibrated in his chest, a sound like grinding stone. His lips curled back just enough to reveal the white gleam of his canines. His eyes, intelligent and cold, were locked on Davies. It wasn't a show of aggression. It was a definitive, chilling judgment, a declaration of threat. Davies took an involuntary step back. His smile was gone completely. He was a man used to controlling every situation, but he had no leverage here. He looked at John, then at the dog. He saw not a man and his pet, but a handler and his weapon. The quiet veteran and the silent, lethal animal. He had fundamentally misjudged the opposition. "This is private property you're standing on, Mr. Carrick," Davies said, his voice regaining some of its smoothness, but with an edge of steel beneath it. "The chapel is not. Our legal team will be in touch. I suggest you don't interfere with our work." He turned and walked back to his SUV without another word. The door closed with a solid, expensive thud. The vehicle turned and disappeared down the track, leaving only the scent of its exhaust and a profound sense of menace hanging in the air. John stood perfectly still, listening until the sound of the engine was gone. He put a hand on Shepard's head. The dog relaxed instantly, the growl vanishing, his body softening. He looked up at John, his tail giving a single, slow wag. The first phase was over. The enemy had been identified. The lines were drawn. The storm broke the next day. It had been threatening for a week, the clouds gathering over the peaks like a slow invasion. Now it arrived, not with a sudden fury, but with a cold, determined rain that soaked the ground and turned the world a uniform shade of gray. The wind moaned through the trees, a low, mournful sound. It was the perfect weather for a fight. They came just before noon. Not one vehicle, but three. 2 heavy-duty work trucks and the same black SUV. They parked at the edge of John's property, a clear line of demarcation. Davies got out of the SUV, this time accompanied by a broad-shouldered man in a hard hat and a rain slicker, the foreman. 4 other men, all dressed for work, emerged from the trucks. They carried equipment, chainsaws, heavy-duty winches, and long steel pry bars. They weren't here to survey. They were here to demolish, to erase the church and everything it represented. John watched them from his porch. He had made his preparations. The footlocker was secure. He had his pack with him, containing water, a first aid kit, and the small tape player with Reverend Abernathy's final recording loaded and ready. Shepard stood beside him, silent and still as the stones of the church itself, the rain darkening his coat. Davies and his crew ignored the cabin. They marched directly towards the woods, towards the path that led to the chapel. John moved to intercept them. He didn't run. He walked, his pace deliberate, and placed himself on the narrow path, blocking their way. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and ran in rivulets down his face. "This is your last warning, Carrick," Davies said, his voice tight with anger. He had abandoned all pretense of politeness. "Stand aside." "You're not touching that church," John said. It was a simple statement of fact. The foreman, a younger man with a military-style haircut and the weary eyes of someone following orders he didn't believe in, looked uneasy. He glanced from John to Davies, then at the ground. He had seen men like John before,
men who didn't make idle threats. Davies, however, was consumed by frustration and arrogance. He was a man accustomed to obstacles melting away before him. John was an immovable object, a glitch in his perfectly planned world. "I don't have time for this," he snarled. He made a reckless, foolish move. He tried to shove past John, to physically push him out of the way. The world narrowed to that single, stupid action. Before John could even react, Shepard did. The dog moved like a gray blur, not to attack Davies, but to place his body between the man and John, a living shield. He didn't bark or bite. He simply absorbed the clumsy shove, his solid body stopping Davies cold. In the chaos of the moment, with the slick, muddy ground and the driving rain, one of the workers behind Davies stumbled. He was carrying a portable generator, a heavy, awkward piece of machinery. He lost his footing, and the generator slipped from his grasp. It fell with a sickening thud, its steel corner striking Shepard a glancing but brutal blow on his left hind leg. The dog yelped, a sharp, piercing cry of pain that cut through the sound of the storm. He collapsed onto the muddy ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He tried to get up, his front paws scrabbling for purchase, but his hindquarters wouldn't obey. He whimpered, a sound of confusion and agony that broke John's heart. Everything stopped. The rain, the wind, the men. It all faded into a roaring silence in John's ears. He saw the foreman flinch, his face tight with regret. He saw Davies, his expression not of concern, but of pure, unadulterated annoyance. The dog was just another obstacle, and the memory, the one he had run from, hit him with the force of a physical blow. The dust, the heat, the radio crackling with Evans's voice, strained and weakening, and his own voice, cold and clear. "Negative, hold your position. We need that intel." The choice, the mission over the man, the objective over the brother in arms, the cold, hard calculus of loss. The same choice stood before him now, stark and terrible in the gray rain. Behind him in the woods was the objective, the church, the evidence, the truth for the people of Havenwood. At his feet was his partner, wounded and helpless. Protect the mission or protect the man. This time there was no hesitation. There was no calculus. There was only loyalty. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside Shepard. He ignored Davies. He ignored the foreman and his crew. He ignored the church and the history it held. His world shrank to the size of his wounded dog. He gently ran his hands over Shepard's leg, his fingers, trained in battlefield first aid, assessing the damage. The bone felt intact, but the joint was already swelling. He shrugged off his field jacket and draped it over the shivering dog, shielding him from the worst of the rain. He looked into Shepard's eyes, which were glazed with pain, but still fixed on him, still full of trust. "I'm here, boy," he whispered. "I've got you." He had made the opposite choice. He had chosen to stay. In that moment, something inside him that had been broken for a decade finally began to mend. He had failed Evans. He would not fail Shepard. John's simple, absolute act of loyalty had a ripple effect he could never have anticipated. The foreman, the one with the military haircut, watched John kneel in the mud, saw the gentle way he covered the dog, and a look of profound disgust crossed his face. He looked at Davies, who was tapping impatiently on his phone, already trying to manage the legal fallout of an injured animal. The foreman had followed orders his whole life, but some orders were indefensible. He made a decision. He turned his back on the group, pulled out his own phone, and with his thumb sent a single, pre-written text message. "It's out of hand." Then he sent a photo he had taken earlier that morning, a clear shot of the fallen bell inside the church ruins.
John, still focused on Shepard, looked up at Davies. His face was calm, his eyes empty of all emotion save a cold, final resolve. "You're done here," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the weight of a verdict. Davies opened his mouth to reply, a sarcastic retort already forming, but the words died on his lips. Another sound had cut through the storm. The distinct, rising and falling wail of a siren, growing steadily closer. A minute later, a battered but official-looking county sheriff's vehicle, its lights flashing erratically, skidded to a stop behind the work trucks.
The passenger door opened, and Martha Riley, the county clerk, stepped out, holding a large umbrella that was immediately rendered useless by the wind. She was followed by a burly, grim-faced sheriff who looked like he had been pulled away from his lunch. Martha marched towards them, her shoes sinking into the mud, a sheaf of papers protected inside her coat. She didn't look at John or the dog. Her sharp eyes were fixed on Davies. "Mr. Davies," she announced, her voice cutting through the wind like a saw. "Pursuant to County Ordinance 1138 regarding the preservation of potential historical sites, I am issuing an immediate cease and desist order. This site," she gestured vaguely towards the woods, "is now under the protection of Harmony County, pending a full historical and archaeological review by the state. All non-essential personnel must vacate the premises immediately." She pulled the papers from her coat and held them out. A court order, stamped and signed that morning. Davies stared at her, dumbfounded. "On what grounds? This is baseless." "On the grounds of photographic evidence of a significant, unrecorded historical structure and a sworn affidavit from a tenured professor of state history," Martha said, her gaze like ice. Dr. Finch was very persuasive, and very, very fast. She had received the foreman's photo of the bell, proof the church was real and substantial, and acted on it with ferocious speed. The foreman had given her the ammunition she needed. The sheriff stepped forward. "You heard the lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Time to go." Davies' authority, so absolute just moments before, had completely evaporated. He was checkmated by a county ordinance, a history professor, and a conflicted foreman's quiet act of defiance. He looked at John, kneeling in the mud with his dog, and he finally understood. He hadn't been defeated by force, but by a quiet, unyielding integrity he couldn't comprehend. He turned, his face a mask of fury, and stalked back to his SUV. His men, looking relieved, quickly packed up their equipment and followed. Within minutes, they were gone. The only sounds left were the rain, the wind, and Shepard's quiet, pained breathing. John looked at Martha, who was now looking down at the dog, her stern expression softening with concern. "Let's get him to the vet," she said. "The county can cover the bill." The morning after the storm was unnaturally beautiful. The rain had scrubbed the air clean, and the valley was saturated with color, the greens deeper, the sky a piercing blue. A profound quiet had settled over the land, the quiet of a battle won, a fever broken. John sat on the steps of his cabin, a fresh mug of coffee in his hands. Beside him, Shepard lay on a thick blanket, his injured leg professionally bandaged and propped on a pillow. The vet in town had confirmed it was a severe sprain and deep bruising, but no break. He would heal. He would walk again. The path to the church was cordoned off with official yellow tape. Beyond it, a small, quiet team was at work. Dr. Alistair Finch was there, his face alight with a kind of holy joy as he directed 2 graduate students in the careful, reverent task of cataloging the contents of the crypt. The ledgers and tapes were now state's evidence. The story of Havenwood was finally being told. Davies and Omnigen were gone, vanished into a storm of their own making, facing a blizzard of lawsuits and a public relations nightmare from which they would never recover.
John heard a car approaching, a different sound this time. A small, sensible sedan. It pulled to a stop, and a woman got out. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 2 years. He hadn't called her. He hadn't called anyone. She was a link to a life he had tried to sever.
She stood by her car for a moment, taking in the scene. John, his face bruised and tired, but somehow lighter than she'd seen it in years. The old dog, bandaged but peaceful. The quiet authority of the yellow tape in the distance. The tension she always carried in her shoulders when dealing with him seemed to drain away.
"I got a call," she said, walking towards him. "From a very determined woman named Martha. Sounded like you were in trouble." John looked up at her. He had expected judgment, questions, the familiar dance of their shared grief and his stubborn silence. Instead, her eyes were just full of concern. "I'm okay," he said. It was the simplest of truths, and yet it felt momentous. She sat down on the step beside him, careful not to jostle Shepard. She looked at the quiet way John's hand rested on the dog's flank, the unconscious gesture of protection and comfort. She saw the worn field jacket draped over a nearby chair, muddy and torn.
She looked at his face, at the new lines around his eyes. They weren't lines of pain anymore. They were lines of resolve.
"You stayed,"
she said, her voice soft. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement. A world of meaning passed between them in those 2 words. You didn't run. You didn't choose the mission. You stayed for the one who needed you. He just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He had spent a decade running from a single moment, a single choice. And here, in this forgotten valley, he had been given the chance to face it again. He had been given a second chance, and he had taken it. The bridge back to the world, back to his family, was not a long, complicated structure. It was a single step, and he had just taken it. In the weeks that followed, the story of Havenwood unfolded. The state officially recognized the church as a historical landmark. The media picked up the story, and descendants of the original families scattered across the country began to emerge, drawn by the resurrected history of their ancestors. A new foundation was established, this one legitimate, with Dr. Finch on the board and a mandate to preserve the site and tell its true story. John was offered a position, caretaker of the St. Jude's Chapel historical site. It was a quiet role, a guardian's role. It meant he could stay. It meant he had a new mission, not of destruction, but of preservation. He accepted. It felt right. It felt like coming home. Months later, autumn had laid its golden hand on the valley. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves. John walked the perimeter of the church grounds, no longer a ruin, but a protected place. The walls had been stabilized, the overgrowth cleared, the fallen bell mounted on a simple wooden frame near the entrance. It was a place of memory, not of sorrow. Shepard walked beside him. His limp was nearly gone, a slight stiffness in his gait the only reminder of the storm. The gray on his muzzle had spread, a touch of silver at his temples. He was an old soldier, content in his quiet posting. John paused and looked at the stone walls of the chapel, standing strong against the deep blue of the autumn sky. He felt the weight of the mountains around him, not as a crushing burden, but as a firm, unyielding foundation. He was no longer running from memory. He was standing on redeemed ground. The silence of the valley was no longer empty. It was full. Full of the whispers of history, the promise of the future, and a profound, unshakable peace. He reached down and placed a hand on Shepard's head. The dog leaned into his touch, a quiet sigh escaping his lips. They stood there together, man and dog, 2 veterans who had found their final peaceful posting. They were home.
This story is for anyone who has ever felt trapped by a past they cannot change.
It is a reminder that quiet miracles are happening all around us, often in the most unexpected places. John's journey was not about finding a hidden church. It was about finding the strength to stay, to choose loyalty over regret, to answer the call to be a guardian of something true and good. It was God's work, unfolding in the ordinary moments of one man's life. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence or a choice that haunts you, remember that redemption is not about erasing the past, but about making a different choice in the present. It is about finding the courage to stay when every instinct tells you to run. May the story of this quiet veteran and his faithful partner be a blessing to you. May it remind you that second chances are real, and that even in the deepest valleys, there is a path to peace. May God bless you and keep you, today and always. Please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And join our community by subscribing for more stories of faith, hope, and the enduring power of a loyal heart.